This channel has been established for visually impaired people. For the visually impaired people, voice narration and a written expression are also provided for the hearing impaired. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Non-agnatic lines: Robertian dynasty, House of Capet, Bosonid dynasty, Carolingian dynasty, Pippinids, Pippin the Elder c. 580–640, Grimoald 616–656, Childebert the Adopted d. 662, Arnulfings, Arnulf of Metz 582–640, Ansegisel d. 662 or 679, Chlodulf of Metz d. 696 or 697, Pepin of Herstal 635–714, Grimoald II d. 714, Drogo of Champagne 670–708, Theudoald d. 741, Carolingians. Charles Martel 686–741, Carloman d. 754, Pepin the Short 714–768, Carloman I 751–771, Charlemagne 742–814, Pepin the Hunchback 768–811, Charles the Younger 772–811, Pepin of Italy 773–810, Louis the Pious 778–840, Pepin I of Aquitaine 797–838. After the Treaty of Verdun 843, Lothair I, Holy Roman Emperor 795–855, Middle Francia Charles the Bald 823–877, West Francia Louis the German 804–876, East Francia v. The Carolingian dynasty, known variously as the Carlovingians, Carolings or Carlings, was a Frankish noble family with origins in the Arnulfing and Pippinid clans of the 7th century AD. The name Carolingian, medieval Latin Carolingi, an altered form of an unattested Old High German Carling, meaning descendant of Charles, cfmhg Curling, derives from the Latinized name of Charles Martel. Carolus. The dynasty consolidated its power in the mid-8th century, eventually making the offices of mayor of the palace and dux et princeps Francorum hereditary, and becoming the de facto rulers of the Franks as the real powers behind the Merovingian throne. In 751, the Merovingian dynasty, which had ruled the Germanic Franks, was overthrown with the consent of the papacy and the aristocracy, and a Carolingian Pepin the Short was crowned king of the Franks. The Carolingian dynasty reached its peak in 800 with the crowning of Charlemagne as the first emperor of Romans in over 3 centuries. His death in 814 began an extended period of fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire and decline that would eventually lead to the evolution of the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire. Contents: 1 History 11 Decline 2 Branches 3 Frankish dynastic relationships 4 Grand Strategy 5 See also 6 References and sources 61 References 62 Sources History Traditional historiography has seen the Carolingian assumption of the Frank kingship as the product of a long rise to power, punctuated even by a premature attempt to seize the throne through Childebert the Adopted. This picture, however, is not commonly accepted today. Rather, the coronation of 751 is seen typically as a product of the aspirations of one man, Pepin, and of the Church, which was always looking for powerful secular protectors and for the extension of its spiritual and temporal influence. The greatest Carolingian monarch was Charlemagne, who was crowned emperor by Pope Leo III at Rome in 800. His empire, ostensibly a continuation of the Western Roman Empire, is referred to historiographically as the Carolingian Empire. The traditional Frankish and Merovingian practice of dividing inheritances among heirs was not given up by the Carolingian rulers, though the concept of the indivisibility of the empire was also accepted. The Carolingians had the practice of making their sons minor kings in the various regions regna of the empire, which they would inherit on the death of their father. Following the death of Louis the Pious, the surviving adult Carolingians fought a 3-year civil war ending only in the Treaty of Verdun, which divided the empire into 3 regna while according imperial status and a nominal lordship to Lothair I. The Carolingians differed markedly from the Merovingians in that they disallowed inheritance to illegitimate offspring, possibly in an effort to prevent infighting among heirs and assure a limit to the division of the realm. In the late 9th century, however, the lack of suitable adults among the Carolingians necessitated the rise of Arnulf of Carinthia as the king of East Francia, a bastard child of a legitimate Carolingian king. Decline: the Carolingians were displaced in most of the regna of the empire by 888. They ruled in East Francia until 911 and held the throne of West Francia intermittently until 900. 987 Carolingian cadet branches continued to rule in Vermandois and Lower Lorraine after the last king died in 987, but they never sought thrones of principalities and made peace with the new ruling families. One chronicler of Sens dates the end of Carolingian rule with the coronation of Robert II of France as junior co-ruler with his father, Hugh Capet, thus beginning the Capetian dynasty. The dynasty became extinct in the male line with the death of Eudes, Count of Vermandois. His sister Adelaide, the last Carolingian, died in 1122. Branches. Carolingian denier of Lothair I, struck in Dorestad, Middle Francia after 850. The Carolingian dynasty has 5 distinct branches: the Lombard branch, or Vermandois branch, or Robertians, descended from Pepin of Italy, son of Charlemagne. Though he did not outlive his father, his son Bernard was allowed to retain Italy. Bernard rebelled against his uncle Louis the Pious, and lost both his kingdom and his life. Deprived of the royal title, the members of this branch settled in France, and became counts of Vermandois, Valois, Amiens and Troyes. The counts of Vermandois perpetuated the Carolingian line until the 12th century. The counts of Chiny and the lords of Melior, Neufchâteau and Falkenstein are branches of the Robertians with the descendants of the counts of Chiny. There would have been Robertian Carolingians to the early 14th century. The Lotharingian branch, descended from Emperor Lothair, eldest son of Louis the Pious. At his death Middle Francia was divided equally between his 3 surviving sons, into Italy, Lotharingia and Lower Burgundy. The sons of Emperor Lothair did not have sons of their own, so Middle Francia was divided between the western and eastern branches of the family in 875. The Aquitanian branch, descended from Pepin of Aquitaine, son of Louis the Pious. Since he did not outlive his father, his sons were deprived of Aquitaine in favour of his younger brother Charles the Bald. Pepin's sons died childless, extinct. 864. The German branch, descended from Louis the German, king of East Francia, son of Louis the Pious. Since he had 3 sons, his lands were divided into Duchy of Bavaria, Duchy of Saxony and Duchy of Swabia. His youngest son Charles the Fat briefly reunited both East and West Francia, the entirety of the Carolingian Empire, but it split again after his death, never to be reunited again with the failure of the legitimate lines of the German branch. Arnulf of Carinthia, an illegitimate nephew of Charles the Fat, rose to the kingship of East Francia at the death of Arnulf's son Louis the Child in 911. Carolingian rule ended in East Francia. The French branch, descended from Charles the Bald, king of West Francia, son of Louis the Pious. The French branch ruled in West Francia, but their rule was interrupted by Charles the Fat of the German branch, 2 Robertians, and a Bosonid. Carolingian rule ended with the death of Louis V of France in 987. Charles, Duke of Lower Lorraine, the Carolingian heir, was ousted out of the succession by Hugh Capet. His sons died childless, extinct. c. 1012. Frankish dynastic relationships. Merovingians, Robertians, Arnulfings, Pippinids, Carolingians, Ottonians, Capetians. Arnulf of Metz 582–640. ITTA 592–652. Lambert II 682–781. Pepin of Herstal approximately 635–714. 697–764. Retrude approximately 690–724. 714–768. Charles III 879–929. Hugh the Great approximately 898–956. Conrad II Salien's Grand Strategy. Carolingian family tree, from the Chronicon Universale of Eckhard of Ora, 12th century. The historian Bernard Bachrach argues that the rise of the Carolingians to power is best understood using the theory of a Carolingian grand strategy. A grand strategy is a long-term military and political strategy that lasts for longer than a typical campaigning season, and can span long periods of time. The Carolingians followed a set course of action that discounts the idea of a random rise in power and can be considered as a grand strategy. Another major part of the grand strategy of the early Carolingians encompassed their political alliance with the aristocracy. This political relationship gave the Carolingians authority and power in the Frankish kingdom. Beginning with Pippin II, the Carolingians set out to put the Regnum Francorum kingdom of the Franks back together, after its fragmentation after the death of Dagobert I, a Merovingian king. After an early failed attempt in ca 651 AD to usurp the throne from the Merovingians, the early Carolingians began to slowly gain power and influence as they consolidated military power as mayors of the palace. In order to do this, the Carolingians used a combination of late Roman Military organization. Along with the incremental changes that occurred between the 5th and 8th centuries because of the defensive strategy the Romans had implemented during the late Empire, the population had become militarized and were thus available for military use. The existence of the remaining Roman infrastructure that could be used for military purposes, such as roads, strongholds and fortified cities, meant that the reformed strategies of the late Romans would still be relevant. Civilian men who lived either in or near a walled city or strong point were required to learn how to fight and defend the areas in which they lived. These men were rarely used in the course of Carolingian grand strategy because they were used for defensive purposes, and the Carolingians were for the most part on the offensive most of the time. Another class of civilians were required to serve in the military, which included going on campaigns. Depending on one's wealth, one would be required to render different sorts of service, and the richer the man was, the greater was his military obligation for service. For example, if rich, one might be required as a knight, or one might be required to provide a number of fighting men in addition to those who owed military service for the lands they had. There were also professional soldiers who fought for the Carolingians. If the holder of a certain amount of land was ineligible for military service, women, old men, sickly men or cowards, they would still owe military service. Instead of going themselves, they would hire a soldier to fight in their place. Institutions, such as monasteries or churches, were also required to send soldiers to fight based on the wealth and the amount of lands they held. In fact, the use of ecclesiastical institutions for their resources for the military was a tradition that the Carolingians continued and greatly benefited from. It was highly unlikely that armies of many more than 100,000 effectives with their support systems could be supplied in the field in a single theatre of operation. Because of this, each landholder would not be required to mobilize all of his men each year for the campaigning season, but instead the Carolingians would decide which kinds of troops were needed from each landholder, and what they should bring with them. In some cases, sending men to fight could be substituted for different types of war machines in order to send effective fighting men. Many institutions would have well-trained soldiers that were skilled in fighting as heavily armored troops. These men would be trained, armored, and given the things they needed in order to fight as heavy troops at the expense of the household or institution for whom they fought. These armed retinues served almost as private armies, which were supported at the expense of the great magnates, were of considerable importance to early Carolingian military organization and warfare. The Carolingians themselves supported their own military household, and they were the most important corps of the standing army in the regnum Francorum. It was by utilizing the organization of the military in an effective manner that contributed to the success of the Carolingians in their grand strategy. This strategy consisted of strictly adhering to the reconstruction of the regnum Francorum under their authority. Bernard Bachrach gives 3 principles for Carolingian long-term strategy that spanned generations of Carolingian rulers. The first principle was to move cautiously outward from the Carolingian base in Austrasia. Its second principle was to engage in a single region at a time until the conquest had been accomplished. The third principle was to avoid becoming involved beyond the frontiers of the regnum Francorum, or to do so when absolutely necessary and then not for the purpose of conquest. This is important to the development of medieval history because without such a military organization and without a grand strategy, the Carolingians would not have successfully become kings of the Franks, as legitimized by the Bishop of Rome. Furthermore, it was ultimately because of their efforts and infrastructure that Charlemagne was able to become such a powerful king and be crowned Emperor of the Romans in 800 AD. Without the efforts of his predecessors, he would not have been as successful as he was, and the revival of the Roman Empire in the West was likely to have not occurred. See also East Francia, West Francia, Carolingian architecture, royal administration of Merovingian and Carolingian dynasties, Carolingian art, Carolingian minuscule, Carolingian Renaissance, list of counts of Vermandois, King of Italy, list of Frankish kings and French monarchs, kings of France, family tree, list of Carolingians descending from Charles Martel, list of Holy Roman emperors and German monarchs, family tree, list of Carolingians descended from Charles Martel. References and sources: Wikimedia Commons has media related to Carolingian dynasty. References: Rudolf Koch, Chrysalis Zamboli 1932 Bachrach, 64 Bachrach, 65 Bachrach, 49–50 Sources: Reuter, Timothy, Germany in the Early Middle Ages 800 1056 New York, Longman, 1991 MacLean, Simon, Kingship and Politics in the Late 9th Century, Charles the Fat and the End of the Carolingian Empire, Cambridge University Press, 2003 Laser, Carl, Communications and Power in Medieval Europe, The Carolingian and Ottonian Centuries, London, 1994 Lott, Ferdinand 18 1991, Origine et signification du mot Carolingian, Revue historique, 461–68–73. Oman, Charles. The Dark Ages, 476–918. 6th ed. London, Rivingtons, 1914. Painter, Sydney. A History of the Middle Ages, 284-1500. New York, Knopf, 1953. Astronomus, Vita Ludovici Imperatoris, ed. G. Pertz, ch. 2, in Mon gen hist scriptores, 2, 608. Reuter, Timothy. Trans. The Annals of Fulda. Manchester Medieval Series, 9th Century Histories, Volume 2. Manchester, Manchester University Press, 1992. Einhard Vita Caroli Magni. Translated by Samuel Epis Turner. New York, Harper & Brothers. 1880. V. E. Pippinids, Arnulfings, and Carolingians. Legend, father of, brother of, Bega, the daughter of Pepin I, married Ansegisel, the son of Arnulf of Metz, and was the mother of Pepin II. Pippinids. Carloman Pepin I. Grimoald I. Childebert the Adopted. Arnulfings. Arnulf of Metz. Chlodulf of Metz. Martin. Ansegisel. Pepin II, his sons Drogo, sons Arnulf Hugh of Champagne. Godfrey Pepin. Grimoald I, son Theudoald. Charles Martel, sons Carloman Pepin III. Griffo Bernard Jerome Remigius. Childebrand I, son Nibelung I. Nibelungids. Early Carolingian sons of Charles Martel. Carloman, son Drogo. Pepin III, sons Charlemagne, sons Pepin the Hunchback. Charles the Younger. Pepin Louis the Pious. Lothair. Drogo. Hugh Theodoric. Carloman, son Pepin. Pepin Bernard, sons Walla Adelard. Bernhard. Carolingian Empire. Sons of Charlemagne. Pepin, son